Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, How to Build Resilient and Equitable Communities with Data-Driven Climate Action Planning. My name is Andy Federer, VP of Marketing here at UrbanFootprint, and I'm joined by my colleagues Kelan Stoy, Manager of Data Science, and Koshy Thomas, Planner and Data Scientist. We thank you for joining us this morning, and we are looking forward to today's discussion. Before we dive into today's topic, I'll take a moment here to walk you through the agenda. First, I'll give you a very brief introduction to who we are and what we do here at UrbanFootprint. Then I'll hand it over to Koshy and Kelan to discuss the role of new technology in climate action and resource planning. We'll discuss how we can help model some of the future impacts of climate action policy, focusing today's study on emissions, resilience, and equity, followed by a live demo of how this works in UrbanFootprint. Finally, we'll wrap up with a live question and answer session. We do encourage you to ask questions during the webinar. Simply type your questions into the Q&A chat box and we'll do our best to answer them as we go or follow up with you after today's session. For those of you that are new to us, UrbanFootprint is software designed to help planners build more sustainable, equitable, and resilient cities. We support hundreds of planners, analysts, and advocates in the private and public sector nationwide, making it easy to map and explore existing conditions for nearly any U.S. location. You can get started just by searching the name of the town, city, or county you'd like to explore. And UrbanFootprint will generate a detailed parcel-scale land use canvas. You can choose to map any of the thousands of out-of-the-box reference layers to further explore existing conditions across a wide range of key planning factors, including transportation, equity, environmental justice, education, and more. Beyond exploring existing conditions, UrbanFootprint is designed to help planners streamline alternative development and test the impacts of future land use scenarios. You can quickly model new scenarios by updating current land use types. And you can analyze the impacts of those changes with our suite of analysis modules, including emissions, water use, vehicle miles traveled, energy use, risk and resilience, and more. And finally, with our newest capability, the Analysis Assumptions Editor, planners can edit almost any of our built-in modules to test policy impacts in future scenarios, which, as we'll see in today's webinar, has some pretty powerful use cases in climate action planning or resource planning. And with that, I'll hand it over to Koshy.
Thanks, Andy. So now that we have some context on who we are and what we do at UrbanFootprint, we wanted to zoom out a bit and focus on some of the key challenges planners face today. Planners are working hard to tackle some of society's toughest challenges, including critical issues of equity, sustainability, housing, new mobility, and many more. In their quest to solve these problems, we recognize that there are many research and implementation challenges planners face at each step of the planning process. First, there are technical challenges of getting your hands on the data, cleaning it up to make it usable, turning it into insights, all of which require a fair amount of technical expertise, and most importantly, time. Beyond technical challenges, planning requires community engagement to ensure local voices are heard, as well as coordination across departments or agencies. Then there's the challenge of effectively communicating this input to policymakers and the actual decision-making process. Last and obvious hurdle is funding. Doing all of the planning requires resources which can be scarce for cities. Funding is also required to implement the recommended measures and programs to help communities reduce emissions and prepare for resilience. While new technology cannot by any means completely solve all the complex challenges planners face, in today's webinar, we hope to show you how some of UrbanFootprint's workflows can help you take a large bite out of the data and technical challenges, which today will focus specifically on climate action planning efforts. When it comes to land use and resource planning in preparation for climate change, planners face a long list of tough questions. How do you reduce emissions, ensure city resilience, and support equitable solutions? When it comes to emissions, we need to know what plans or programs will effectively reduce emissions and how these policies may impact other community factors like transit accessibility, household costs, and more. To support city resilience, prepare for climate adaptation, and safeguard communities from natural disasters, planners need to evaluate plans with the risks of sea rise, flood, and fire hazard in mind as well. Lastly, planners evaluate these issues through the lens of equity and ask themselves whether these plans address the needs of disadvantaged communities. Does the proposed plan address the needs and characteristics of the community at risk? As we dive into these policy areas, we thought it'd be helpful to ground our model with an actual climate action plan. For today's example, we'll focus on Oakland, California. In July 2009, the Oakland City Council set a goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 36% below 2005 levels by 2020, and build a path to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 83% below 2005 levels by 2050. Their plan cited transportation and land use, building energy use, material consumption, and waste as significant sources of greenhouse gas emissions for the city. In an effort to hit these goals, Oakland outlined several specific goals and policy actions they would take, including a 20% reduction in vehicle miles traveled annually, saving 24 million gallons of oil, a 32% decrease in electricity consumption, a 14% decrease in natural gas consumption, and producing a lot more in renewable energy annually. Now, as you think about these targets in relation to your own current or potential future climate action plan goals, you may be wondering, how can I build a data-driven plan to select and achieve similar effective climate action goals for my community or project? In an effort to answer this key question, planners must consider a wide range of policy levers to test and measure, including land use, energy use, water use, transportation, environmental conservation, waste reduction, consumption, business and workforce incentives, and more. We recognize that Urban Footprint can't currently cover the entirety of this wide scope of challenges, but we can help to quickly build potential solutions in the first 5 highlighted areas. This is where we'll focus our tutorial today and walk you through several example workflows in Urban Footprint. Andy mentioned this earlier in his intro to Urban Footprint, but as a quick refresher, Urban Footprint has 10 out-of-the-box analysis modules you can use to understand existing conditions or model future land use scenarios and their impacts on metrics like household costs, transit accessibility, vehicle miles traveled, and more. The emissions module specifically estimates greenhouse gas emissions associated with vehicle transportation, building energy use, and building water use. With the click of a button, you can view current or future emissions levels. Here's a quick snapshot of what this looks like in Urban Footprint. In this example, we've run the emissions module for the city of Oakland. Darker shades of red indicate parcels with higher emissions production, while the lighter hues of orange and yellow indicate lower emissions production. When building a plan to lower emissions, probably one of the first things we'll want to know is, what does emissions production look today in my city? In our Oakland example, we ran the emissions module for existing conditions and calculated over 600,000 metric tons per year of greenhouse gas emissions. It can be attributed to the passenger vehicle transportation, and over 1 million metric tons per year are generated from building energy use. While Urban Footprint comes preloaded with these regionalized use rates, if you already have more specific rates, like from our partner Equitable, you can edit the module to customize these parameters to analyze current conditions and test policy impacts for future scenarios. Next, we'll explore how programs or policies to improve building energy efficiency may impact emissions production with Urban Footprint's new analysis assumptions editor. To get started, we'll simply create a new scenario and adjust key assumptions to measure projected impacts or test targeted interventions. In this example, I use the editor to apply Oakland's goal of 32% reduction in electricity consumption across all dwelling unit types and employment categories. Alternatively, an example of a targeted intervention we could test for building energy efficiency is a future scenario where all detached single-family homes get rebates to switch to LED lights or have solar panels in the future. Because Urban Footprint lets you create any number of these scenarios, it's easy to think of the analysis assumptions editor as a sandbox to test your ideas. For this next question, one of the goals of the climate action plan is to reduce natural gas use by 14%. I combined this change and the parameters we edited in the last scenario to create a combined scenario to measure the net effect. Similar to what we did for electricity use in the previous slide, I applied the 14% reduction on all categories, or you could specify more targeted interventions. After our electricity and natural gas retrofits, we might want to model the impacts of phasing in cleaner energy sources to the grid. For example, will future energy sources for your city come from solar or nuclear power? By reducing the electricity CO2 equivalent parameter, or simply the emission rate for generating electricity, it helps us to model a scenario where emissions are reduced with the increased adoption of cleaner energy sources. For our last scenario in this series, we're going to look at the transportation side of the emissions module. In UrbanFootprint, we calculate the emissions produced by passenger vehicle miles traveled. One of Oakland's goals was to reduce fuel consumption by 24 million gallons. By increasing the fuel economy parameter, or simply the miles traveled per gallon, we achieved half that goal. By choosing to include that intervention along with the ones we have seen in the past few slides, we've reduced the overall emissions from over 1.5 million metric tons per year to a little over 1 million. That's a reduction of about 30%. Remember, Oakland's overall goal was to reduce emissions by 36%. Another parameter we can tweak is the fuel CO2 equivalent emission rate, or simply the emissions rates per gallon of fuel consumed. In a hypothetical scenario, actually one that is becoming more real by the day, we can test the impacts of more vehicles moving from carbon-based fuels to electric or hydrogen-based ones by reducing the fuel CO2 equivalent emission rate. Now that we've covered the energy and transportation-related emissions, UrbanFootprint also measures emissions associated with the treatment, supply, and distribution of water. Water-related emissions are often far less than transportation and energy, but remain an important part of the emissions ecosystem. UrbanFootprint lets users modify two parameters associated with water-related emissions. For one, we can reduce the electricity consumed associated with supplying water for indoor and water use separately. In this scenario on the bottom right, I made a change to reduce the electricity used for both indoor and outdoor water use. Another path is to model the reduction in water usage by the end user. For example, this could be to test scenarios where there's an increase in water efficiency or reduced outdoor irrigation. Another example could be improving the water supply systems in your project area so that pipelines have fewer leaks, for example. The parameters we modify are the same. We can choose how many gallons per capita per day each type of housing or job sector uses. In this example, I made a targeted change to detached single-family housing and jobs in the public administration sector. Often, climate action plans explicitly call out reduction of emissions, energy use, water use for government facilities. With UrbanFootprint, it is easy to model this by making the change to assumptions associated with public administration employees. The conservation module, available to projects created in California, also measures above and below ground carbon stock. Above ground carbon includes carbon stocks in live vegetation, while soil carbon includes carbon stocks in the soil up to a depth of 30 centimeters. When the soil layer is broken or foundations are laid or trees are felled for new construction, the organic carbon content in the soil and trees are released into the atmosphere. Some background in this map you see on the right. For the California high-speed rail project, Gilroy, California went through an exercise where they had to pick one of two alignments for the tracks. One going through downtown, seen in red, the other outside of town in the neighboring agriculture areas. UrbanFootprint's conservation module reported there would be about 4,500 metric tons of organic carbon lost, which is equivalent to about 3,500 vehicles driven in 1 year. Finally, the scenarios we've modeled in the past few slides assumed the population and jobs in the project area remain the same. This is, of course, rarely the case. Some cities are growing at a rapid pace, while others see decline. UrbanFootprint can also model the emissions impact of land use changes. By painting the projections of population and jobs into scenarios, we can measure the impacts of our plan's policies while also accounting for future growth in your project area. With that, I would like to hand it over to my colleague, Kelan, who will go through the resilience and equity pieces of this webinar.
Thanks, Koshy. First, I'm going to cover resiliency planning. In addition to emissions reduction, another important aspect of climate action and preparedness planning is assessing how vulnerable a community is to natural disasters and climate change. Urban Footprint includes a risk and resilience module designed to help planners prepare for the projected impacts of things like sea level rise, flooding risk, and wildfire hazard. Similar to the emissions module, you can click to run the module for existing conditions or a future scenario to quickly understand what areas lie at sea level rise risk, flood risk, or in a fire hazard zone. For our Oakland example, we're also going to select 3 additional reference layers from our built-in data library: liquefaction risk, landslide risk, and earthquake fault zones, to better understand what areas are especially vulnerable to earthquakes. Now we'll take a closer look at how we got here and produce more detailed exhibits to examine what areas are currently prone to natural hazards and climate change. The Risk and Resilience module first brings in FEMA flood hazard areas, which impact part of the city, primarily areas nearby streams and surrounding the lake. Next, we have the CAL FIRE fire hazard severity zones. You can see that most of the Oakland Hills are designated as high or very high fire hazard zones. Next, we have sea level rise. This map is showing the area that would be inundated with 1.4 meters, or roughly 4.5 feet, of sea rise. Urban Footprint is loaded with different models of sea rise, so you can see how different sources vary in their assessment of areas that will be flooded. The sea rise aspect of the risk and resilience analysis is reported by sea rise level, so users can see impacts associated with different climate change projections. Oakland also faces the very real threat of earthquakes, with the Hayward Fault Zone running straight through the hills. This map displays areas designated as fault zones by the California Department of Conservation, which is an additional reference data set available in Urban Footprint. California also designates areas at risk of landslides, primarily in the hills, and liquefaction, both places that increase the risk of damage during an earthquake. With these natural hazards in mind, Urban Footprint intersects these hazard areas with our parcel-scale land use data set to get figures for the associated structures and population at risk, demonstrated by the Risk and Resilience module charts on the right side of the screen here. This gives us the data we need to answer key questions like, will our climate action plan be putting more or less people at risk? And of course, we can also examine this data spatially. Continuing with our Oakland example, here we map all parcels lying in any of these hazard areas, be it sea rise, flooding, wildfire, liquefaction, landslides, or fault zones. The chart here is showing the percent of the Oakland population that lives in risk areas for each type of hazard. The analysis shows that 40% of Oakland, or roughly 150,000 people, live in liquefaction zones. Another 16%, or 66,000 people, live in wildfire hazard severity zones. 2% of the population live in areas that could be flooded with up to 6 feet of sea level rise. And while focusing primarily on existing conditions in our risk and resiliency example today, it's also important to keep in mind that we can use this information to compare how a climate action and adaptation plan may impact communities in future land use scenarios. In addition to examining how land use decisions may impact risk and resilience factors, we can further examine how developing in less risky areas might impact other factors like household costs, transit accessibility, vehicle miles traveled, and more. Next, with emissions and resilience data at our fingertips, we need to better understand how these issues are impacting people in our community. Specifically, how does a climate action plan address the needs of disadvantaged communities? Using the Urban Footprint data library, we can add more layers to the analysis, incorporating aspects such as equity. One of the equity data sets available is the California Communities Environmental Health Screening Tool, better known as Kelan and Screen. Kelan and Screen identifies communities by census tract that are disproportionately burdened by and vulnerable to multiple sources of pollution. The map shows that the most disadvantaged communities in Oakland are in low-lying areas of West Oakland and East Oakland, while the least disadvantaged communities are generally higher in the Oakland Hills. And what we'll see is that there is a clear spatial relationship between the levels of disadvantage and the types of hazard these communities face. First, with the least disadvantaged communities, these areas are clearly at risk of wildfire, as well as earthquake fault zones and the associated landslide risk. when we isolate the most disadvantaged communities, we see a clear relationship with the other types of hazard. First is sea level rise, where we can see that the low-lying disadvantaged areas are clearly at the most risk of sea level rise. The most disadvantaged areas are also almost entirely built on liquefaction zones. Put to population numbers, we can see that over 50% of the least disadvantaged population lives in fire hazard zones, and over 80% of the most disadvantaged population lives in liquefaction areas, with another 12% at risk of sea rise. If we're looking to ensure the needs of disadvantaged communities are included in our plans, this is something we're going to want to consider. Okay, now that we've walked through some example workflows, let's take a look at a live example in UrbanFootprint. I'm going to move over to a tab here in my web browser where I've already logged into UrbanFootprint. Just a reminder that UrbanFootprint is a web-based software. There's nothing to download or install. You just have to log in and UrbanFootprint takes care of the rest. The first thing I'm going to do is create a new project. UrbanFootprint works anywhere in the United States. And for this example, I'm going to choose Savannah, Georgia. All you need to do is type your project name, select your organization, and type in your project area into the dropdown. With that, it'll give me an option of whether I'd like to choose census blocks or parcels. In this case, I'm going to choose parcels, and I'll click Create. Now, UrbanFootprint is busy compiling all of the parcel data for the Savannah base canvas. It's also identifying all the reference data sets available in the UrbanFootprint data library for this area. And usually this just takes a few seconds.
So while that's going on, I think we have time to take a question here. Questions from Ben. Does your model assume a constant level of population, or can that be tweaked for a growth rate? So guys, how do we deal with population growth over time?
Yeah, that's a very good question. UrbanFootprint allows multiple ways of creating scenarios. One is just maintaining a constant population, where you're only tweaking factors related to the existing housing stock, for example. But also with UrbanFootprint, you can build out new land use scenarios where you add new population and also perhaps new jobs to the area to meet potential future land use targets.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, okay. So now we have our project created in Savannah, Georgia. As you can see, the UrbanFootprint base canvas has automatically been added to the map where we can see all of the parcels in this area. I'm going to start by just giving you a quick tour of the interface. First, in the bottom right, we have the ability to change our base map with such options as satellite imagery and many others. On the map itself, we can easily zoom in and out and also change our view perspective to have a more oblique view at the map. We can also make selections on the active layers on our map here. On the left, we have our layer list, which manages what data sets we can see on the map. We can add new data sets to our project through the layer manager, which shows all of the created data sets ready out of the box with UrbanFootprint. As you can see, the layer manager includes useful metadata for the layers, as well as links to their original sources. We can start by adding the sea rise data sets from NOAA that we discussed in the presentation. I'll just pick a few of these here from Georgia, and we'll add 6 feet as well. These layers are broken down into different sea rise level scenarios, and I just picked a few of them that you can see in the background were automatically added to the layer list. And while we're here, I'm going to add a few more useful reference layers, like transit lines and stops, which we have pre-processed for the entire country, the FEMA floodplains, and building footprints as well. Okay. With that, I'll close out, and we can now look at what these layers look like on the map. I'll start by adding the FEMA flood hazard areas. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do a quick edit to the symbology just to emphasize the at-risk areas as part of this data set. I'll click Save. And on top of this, I'm going to add in the transit stops and lines, as well as building footprints. Okay. And with that, in just a few clicks, we have a pretty good map emphasizing the areas at risk of flooding in Savannah, Georgia. If we like how the map looks, it's easy to export it to put into a presentation or document with the UrbanFootprint map export feature. So now let's swap out the FEMA data set and instead look at the sea rise data sets. We can step through each of these different sea level rise scenarios to see what areas would be impacted in Savannah associated with different climate projections and associated sea level rise. Here we're looking at the 1 feet areas that would be inundated, and now 6 feet. And as mentioned in the presentation, UrbanFootprint also prepackages this type of analysis with a risk and resiliency module. If I go into Analyze mode, I can see all of the analysis modules ready for my project. All I have to do is click Run, and the system will generate an analysis of the amount of dwelling units, people, and jobs at risk of natural hazards. While I'm at it, I can run the emissions module that Koshy described in the presentation. Now, these analyses typically just take a few minutes to run. And for the sake of time, I'm going to jump over to another project where I've already run this analysis. So here we have the risk and resiliency module already complete. And I can click on the data set, which will show me both the spatial output of the results of the module, which is demonstrating all of the parcels in Savannah, Georgia, that are at risk of any of these flooding zones in the FEMA layer. It's also demonstrating summary statistics of the total number of dwelling units, population, and jobs at risk across the city. We can see that there are 7,000 dwelling units at risk of flooding in Savannah, and another 3,200 dwelling units at risk of sea level rise. We can also now layer in some considerations of equity into this risk analysis. I'll start by adding areas considered to be racially concentrated areas of poverty to the map, as identified by HUD. This is just one of the many different indicators for identifying disadvantaged communities available in UrbanFootprint. Now we can see on the map already that many of these disadvantaged areas also correlate with areas at risk of flooding and sea level rise. We can take a further dive here by joining the risk and resiliency spatial output layer against the disadvantaged areas. So using the filter mode in UrbanFootprint, I can join against these concentrated areas of poverty. And now if I open the data table, it'll show me the areas that are both at risk of flooding and considered to be disadvantaged communities in Savannah, Georgia. And it's showing me that there are about 300 dwelling units or 782 individuals that are in disadvantaged communities and at risk of flooding. Now I'm going to go back to the original project to demonstrate how we can introduce policy changes across scenarios using the analysis assumptions editor. I'll start by clearing out these different reference layers that we added to the map. Okay. You can access the editor directly from Analyze mode, just by clicking on the pencil icon here. This takes us to a view where we can see all of the regionalized default assumptions for each analysis module. Here we are looking at energy use intensity factors, measuring how much electricity or natural gas a household uses in a year. These values come from the EIA's Residential Energy Consumption Survey. If you have more granular data available, you can enter it here to further localize the analysis. I'm going to now show how we can quickly build out some aspects of a climate action planning process just using the editor. We'll start with energy use rates. So first, I'm just making a copy of the base scenario where now I can start to tweak these analysis assumptions to introduce changes to how much electricity different types of homes use. We can ask questions such as, what impact would a 20% reduction in electricity demand in single-family homes have on overall energy use and emission totals? I'll do that here by swapping out these numbers with a 20% reduction. Now with my changes in place, I'll click Save. And that's now part of this new scenario that I created. Next, I can build off this scenario to introduce new policy changes as well. This time, let's focus instead on the carbon intensity of the electricity source, or going into the emissions module here. What impact would sourcing more solar energy have on our overall targets? I can introduce that by modifying the electricity CO2 equivalent factor. In this case, I'm just going to do something drastic and halve the number to 500. Again, I'll click Save. And now in scenario 2, we have the introduction of renewables to the grid source of the electricity and the residential retrofitting program, both included in that scenario. So last step, I'm going to make one last scenario where, as Koshy demonstrated in the presentation, we can make some changes to the transport sector as well. Here, I'm going to edit the fleet average miles per gallon rate to test out what impact improved fuel efficiency would have on total emissions. Here, I'm going to update this to an average of 30 miles per gallon. And again, I'll hit Save. Now, once I've set up these scenarios, it's just a matter of going back to Analyze mode and running the analysis for each scenario. So I'll hit Run, here and here, and the same here as well. And again, these analyses usually take just a few minutes to run. But for the sake of time, we can go back to the pre-curated project to look at what these outputs look like side by side. So to do this, we can go into reporting mode in UrbanFootprint. And here we'll start by looking at the energy use impacts. So this first tab is just summary statistics on the total number of population, dwelling units, and households, which you kind of addressed in the first question that we had. But if I go to the energy use tab, this is now demonstrating the outputs related to the interventions that we made to reduce the energy use intensity factors just for single-family homes, which you can see is the change from the base scenario to this first single-family housing retrofit scenario that I created. Next, if we move on to the emissions tab, we can see the impact that our other interventions of introducing perhaps more solar to the grid or increasing the average mile per gallon of the vehicle fleet. We can see how all of these factors come together to bring us closer to our greenhouse gas reduction targets. And if we want to take this analysis a step further, or perhaps curate some of these numbers for a report or a presentation, UrbanFootprint makes it very easy to export all of this information as a spreadsheet. So we can get the outputs of the module runs as an Excel file, and we can also go into the inputs as well. And the inputs for all of our analysis modules are also available for export. So you can have the full package of your scenario creation process available for your final reports. I'll conclude the demo on that note and pass it back over to Andy, who'll be wrapping up our presentation and starting off the question and answer session. Thanks.
Thanks, Kelan and Koshy, for that awesome presentation. Great job, guys. And thanks again to our wonderful audience for taking the time to join us today. If you have any questions or would like to discuss a specific use case, we'd love to hear from you. Please feel free to follow up with us using the window that just appeared on your browser, or send us a note by going to our website at UrbanFootprint.com. And with that, we're going to start our question and answer session. We've had a few questions come in. If you still have an opportunity, you still do have an opportunity to send us more questions. So with that said, I would like to take an easy one here. It's a question about, is the webinar being recorded and will the slides be made available afterwards? The answer there is yes. We will be sending out an email after the webinar, letting everyone know how to access those materials. Next question is around location intelligence. So the question here is, can you use the resilience outputs to provide locational intelligence and sort of capacity and design considerations for investments around water treatment facilities, green infrastructure, shared district infrastructure, and things like that?
Yeah, I can perhaps field that one. I would say definitely part of the workflow or intended workflow with Urban Footprint is to make this type of analysis an integral process to how you're going about planning. So it could be you run this right when you start your project to get a sense of these risk areas and use that input as you in turn are designing perhaps a corridor plan, which areas to intensify, and other aspects such as that. So yeah, I would think that does work.
Okay, great. Another question here, and I think you've maybe covered a little bit of this during the live demo, but maybe we can expand on some of the capabilities of Urban Footprint. Is it possible to overlay emissions and climate information with community and design and development objectives to understand environmental, economic, health, and social benefits? So in other words, how do you use all the data in Urban Footprint to answer questions?
Well, one of the things we pride on is the ability to add data sets to a map. So like to spatially look at like what Kelan went through in his resilience and equity pieces was the ability to load layers that are equity specific, but also have the resilience aspect of the module. To see it all at once on a map provides much greater location insights. And in addition to that, like in some cases, we might not have very localized data for your project. Urban Footprint lets you bring in your own data. If you have spatial data, you can upload them as zip shapefiles, and we ingest that pretty quickly, and you can view it on the exact same map as the layers of equity and resilience we had in this demo.
Okay.
And I'll also add that, as I kind of demonstrated in the example demo, that you can use these different data sets to further curate selections. So you can mix and match the data sets available in Urban Footprint to further hone in on particular areas. So that could span health data sets, distance to transit,
right,
and other factors that you're interested in looking at.
Perfect. Thank you. On the topic of data, we have a question related to just our parcel data coverage. Like, how do you guys work with that data to make sure it's always as accurate as it needs to be? Can you maybe walk people through the process you use to gather data from multiple sources and make sure it's ready for people to use?
Yeah, I can feel that one. So we cover about 90% of the people in the US in terms of parcel coverage. We cover it in all counties with greater than 45,000 people. So it's pretty detailed. We get that data set from a proprietary source. The geometries come from them, and we use some of their data attributes. But the value add we provide is that we join this parcel data set with a lot of other supplemental data sets, like from the census, from OSM, from OSM being OpenStreetMap, and a lot of other data sets to kind of enhance what people see in the app. So for example, our base canvas has over 70 plus columns. It has details about population, dwelling units, employment by type. And we try to track these so that they're most accurate to today. And we have processes in our pipelines to make sure the aggregate totals match up to what the census tells us it is, to make sure we're showing the right data.
Okay. Question here from John. Does UrbanFootprint have a way of doing scenario planning to account for reduced risk and vulnerability based on increased adaptive capacity, such as improved building codes, retrofits, things like that? And then follow up, how often are you updating and expanding available data sets? So maybe start with that, because we just talked about data, and then we can talk about the...
Yeah, so as far as the data library and the data sets available there, we are constantly updating those. So as we are seeing updates happen upstream from perhaps FEMA or other sources, we have it part of our pipeline to bring in this new data to make sure that whenever you're creating a new project, you have access to the latest and greatest information. And as for the second aspect of increasing or having the analysis respond to some of these factors that may be related to the building code or other ways to mitigate risk, I'll say that the risk and resiliency module, as it's currently designed, displays the number of structures at risk. So even if you're introducing new structures, it will say that they're still at risk areas.
Right.
What you can do from there is, because we in UrbanFootprint allow you to design new building types that might, you can designate them as having this type of building code built into them. You can then take the analysis that one step further to say, well, even though we've built newer, more dense housing in these risk areas, it's been mitigated by the fact that all of the housing that we've introduced effectively is retrofitted or built to withstand these impacts.
That's right. Okay, great. Let's see, question from Harrison. How does UrbanFootprint work with other climate models like ICLEI? And I'll provide some background for everyone before we dive into an answer there. UrbanFootprint does have a partnership with ICLEI where their ClearPath tool provides integration with UrbanFootprint. You're able to take outputs from ClearPath, bring them into UrbanFootprint, and vice versa. So maybe you guys want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, so one exciting thing with our partnership with ICLEI is that we're really trying to improve and make sure that UrbanFootprint users have access to this hyper-granular data that, and many times the cities themselves have already gone through this process to build out their detailed inventory, and want to make sure that with the ICLEI inventory framework, where it's kind of a top-down based on total electricity use and other factors, that the UrbanFootprint spatial model also gets you to those same totals. So one of the things that we're excited that we're going to be working on soon is further facilitating this integration by making it easier to out of the box directly have any inventories that you've created with ICLEI's ClearPath tool available in UrbanFootprint for your project.
Okay, great. Next question here from an anonymous attendee. Their workflow, they say, often involves exporting mapping outputs to other software to kind of refine the design. And the basics of the question are, how does UrbanFootprint facilitate that? How do you export information or data itself out of the software?
UrbanFootprint allows the export of almost all of the data sets directly as, for example, a shapefile. So if you're looking to use another GIS software, it's very easy to get information out for perhaps further curation in that way. As I briefly demonstrated, you can export maps quickly. So if you don't have access to these other types of software, you can use UrbanFootprint to generate your exhibits. But then also, if you are looking to use something like InDesign, we allow the export of layers as SVG files so that you can take the data from UrbanFootprint and bring it into Illustrator for perhaps curation of the way the shapes look, or cleaning up the road lines and other things like that. So there's a lot of ways you can pull the information out of UrbanFootprint to take it that next step to get it ready for however you need it presented.
Okay, great. So this is kind of a last call for questions. If you have anything that you would like answered, please feel free to drop that into either the chat or the Q&A. Question from Tom here. He says, risk areas and criteria are not exclusive. Risks and criteria overlap. How does UrbanFootprint account for that?
I think I would need a little more context as far as criteria, but definitely the risk areas are obviously not the only factor that are important when you're trying to assess which particular households or structures will be at risk. That's particularly true for earthquakes, where it's not just where it is in space, but what the structure of the building is, what it was built with, what standards it was built to.
That's right.
So those factors, some of them are available via additional assessor's information that we have for the parcel, which sometimes covers aspects of the building form and perhaps type of roof or things like that. So that's one option. For the other side, there's a lot of local data that you could bring in for the particular city that would likely add this extra layer to really identify what the true at-risk places are. And I would say the easiest way to build that in would be to use UrbanFootprint's upload feature to take in separate spatial information and then join it to the results of the area analysis. So you can bring these things, get what's currently available out of the box with UrbanFootprint, and then layer in more and more information so you can further hone in on these risk areas by multiple factors.
Okay, so with that said, I think that covers all the questions I have from the audience. I'd like to thank everyone again for attending today's webinar and look forward to seeing you on future webinars. That said, everyone have a great rest of your day.